The fluorescent lights hum in the Basel Committee's conference room, casting sterile shadows across mahogany tables where men in tailored suits shuffle documents marked confidential implementation timeline. Outside, the streets of Switzerland are quiet, indifferent. But inside this room, on a winter morning in 2017, banking regulators from 27 nations are finalizing something extraordinary, a set of rules so sweeping, so transformative, that when fully implemented, they will fundamentally reshape how $300 trillion of global debt is measured, managed, and perhaps erased. The date circled on every regulator's calendar, January 2026. They call it Basel III Endgame. The world calls it something else, the Great Reset. But here's what they don't tell you in the press releases, what gets buried in the footnotes of 1,000-page regulatory documents. This isn't just about making banks safer. This is about survival. Because the global financial system is drowning, and 2026 might be the year they finally decide who gets a lifeboat and who gets left behind. Right now, at this very moment, every person on Earth owes $37,500. You didn't sign up for this debt. You didn't even know it existed. But it's yours. A newborn in Mumbai, a farmer in Iowa, a teacher in Lagos. The math doesn't discriminate. $300 trillion of global debt, spread across 8 billion people, creates a number so obscene it barely registers as real. Except it is real, and it's growing. The global debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 349%, meaning the world collectively owes 3.5 times more than it produces in a year. To put that in perspective, before the 2008 financial crisis, you remember that one, the collapse that nearly ended capitalism itself. Global debt leverage was 278%. We've added 71 percentage points in 15 years. We didn't just fail to learn our lesson. We doubled down. And now, as interest rates climb from the near-zero wonderland of the past decade to levels not seen since before the Great Recession, the bill is coming due. $3 trillion in additional interest expenses annually. That's $380 for every human being, just a service debt that keeps expanding like a malignant tumor. Here's the question that should keep you awake at night. When does a debt crisis stop being a crisis and start being a feature of the system itself? When does inevitable become intentional? The architects of this moment understood something crucial that most people miss. There are only 3 ways to resolve unsustainable debt. You can grow your way out of it, inflating the economy until the debt becomes manageable in proportion to wealth. You can cut spending to the bone, enduring years of austerity, unemployment, and social unrest until the ledgers balance. Or you can do what empires have done since the Romans. You restructure. You reset. You wipe the slate clean. Not entirely, of course. That would be chaos. But selectively, strategically, with surgical precision. In 2022, analysts at S&P Global published a report that sent quiet shockwaves through financial circles. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed not to cause panic. But the message was unmistakable. There's no easy way to keep global leverage down, they wrote. This will require a great reset of policymaker mindset and community acceptance. There it was, buried in paragraph 7 of a 73-page document. The admission that the current trajectory is unsustainable, that choices will have to be made, that some debts will need to be written down. The report projected that by 2030, global debt could reach $336 trillion under baseline scenarios. But here's where it gets interesting. They also outline an optimistic scenario where, through coordinated action, debt leverage could be reduced to pre-pandemic levels. Coordinated action. That phrase appears 47 times in Basel Committee documents. It means something very specific in the world of international finance. Synchronized policy changes implemented simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions so that no single nation takes the competitive hit of stricter regulations. It means everyone moves together or no one moves at all. And they're moving. Right now, as we speak, implementation of Basel III Endgame is being phased in across Europe, Asia, and despite fierce resistance from American banks, eventually in the United States. The United Kingdom pushed its deadline to January 2027. The The European Union delayed elements until 2026 and 2027, citing concerns regarding the international level playing field. Everyone's watching everyone else, waiting to see who blinks first, who will bear the cost of being the responsible actor in a system built on mutually assured financial destruction. But make no mistake, it's happening. Banks with over $100 billion in assets, the systemic players, the too-big-to-fail institutions that hold the global economy hostage, are being forced to hold more capital, to measure risk more conservatively, to acknowledge losses they've been hiding in optimistic projections and favorable accounting. The fundamental review of the trading book, a component of Basel III, forces banks to calculate the risk of their trading activities with brutal honesty. No more gaming the models. No more pretending that a mortgage-backed security full of subprime loans is as safe as a U.S. Treasury bond. The output floor, perhaps the most revolutionary element, prevents banks from using their own internal risk models to reduce capital requirements below a certain threshold. In plain English, banks can't lie to themselves anymore about how risky their bets are. For decades, major financial institutions employed armies of quantitative analysts, brilliant mathematicians who built complex models proving that risky investments weren't actually that risky. These models said that the housing market couldn't crash nationwide. These models said that Greek sovereign debt was perfectly safe. These models were catastrophically wrong. The output floor says, we don't care what your models tell you. You will hold real capital, measurable capital, capital that exists whether your assumptions are right or wrong. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand the hidden machinery that determines whether your savings retain their value or evaporate overnight, consider leaving a like. It helps bring more of these hidden chapters of financial history to light. Because what's coming isn't just an accounting adjustment. What's coming is a reckoning. Let's talk about what happens when $300 trillion of debt collides with structurally higher interest rates in an economy that can't grow fast enough to outrun its obligations. First, understand the landscape. Government debt-to-GDP ratios surged 76% between 2007 and 2022, reaching 102%. Corporations levered up 31% to 98% debt to GDP. Meanwhile, the debt has become less productive. Each dollar borrowed adds less to economic growth than it did 15 years ago. You're pouring water into a leaking bucket, and the leak keeps getting bigger. Why? Because much of the borrowing wasn't for productive investment, new factories, infrastructure, innovation. It was for stock buybacks, dividend payments, mergers and acquisitions that shuffled ownership without creating value. It was for government spending on constituencies that demanded services but rejected the taxes to pay for them. It was for zombie companies, businesses that generate just enough cash flow to service interest payments, but not enough to ever repay principal, sustained on life support by artificially low interest rates. For over a decade after 2008, central banks kept rates near zero. Money was effectively free. Borrow $1 billion, and the interest might be less than inflation, meaning you're paid to take on debt. Pension funds desperate for returns bought bonds from bankrupt nations. Insurance companies loaded up on corporate debt from companies one recession away from insolvency. Everyone pretended this was normal. Everyone pretended it could last forever. It couldn't, and everyone knew it couldn't. Inflation, dormant for years, roared back with a vengeance in 2021 and 2022. Supply chains snapped. Energy prices exploded. Workers, emboldened by tight labor markets, demanded raises. Central banks faced a choice: let inflation destroy the value of money itself, or raise interest rates and reveal just how fragile the debt-fueled economy had become. They chose the latter. The Federal Reserve raised rates by 4 percentage points in 2022. The European Central Bank by 2. Overnight, the cost of servicing $300 trillion of global debt jumped by approximately $3 trillion annually in additional interest expenses. That's 3% of global GDP just vanishing into interest payments, not building hospitals or researching clean energy or feeding the hungry, just servicing debt. And it gets worse. As fixed-rate debt matures and gets refinanced at higher rates, that $3 trillion becomes $8.6 trillion. $1,080 per person every year forever just to tread water. Developing nations found themselves in particularly cruel circumstances. During the easy money years, they borrowed heavily, denominated in dollars and euros, to build infrastructure and fund development. Now, with their currencies weakening and interest rates climbing, nations like Zambia, Ghana, and Sri Lanka have defaulted or teetered on the edge. Over 50 developing countries spend more than 10% of their revenues just on interest payments. Think about that. $1 out of every 10 collected in taxes goes not to schools or roads or hospitals, but to creditors in New York, London, and Beijing. 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on education or health combined. The human cost is invisible in spreadsheets, but devastating in reality. Austerity budgets, pension cuts, reduced public services, political instability, migration crises, governments fall, populists rise, the social contract phrase, and the debt? The debt keeps growing. China presents its own catastrophe in slow motion. Chinese corporations account for a third of global corporate debt. The average Chinese company carried debt 6 times its annual earnings in 2021, twice the global average. Real estate developers borrowed hundreds of billions to build cities no one would inhabit. Local governments issued bonds backed by land sales that have now collapsed. The entire economic miracle of the past 4 decades was built on a foundation of leverage that's now crumbling. When China stumbles, the world doesn't just feel the tremor. It feels the earthquake, because China isn't just the world's factory, it's the world's creditor. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China lent hundreds of billions to developing nations for infrastructure projects. Those nations now can't repay. China must choose: write off the loans and accept massive losses, or insist on repayment and watch countries collapse, taking Chinese geopolitical influence with them. This is the trap. Everyone owes everyone else. Default cascades. Contagion spreads. The web of interdependence that was supposed to create stability instead creates fragility. You can't let one thread unravel without risking the whole tapestry. So what do? You coordinate. You reset. The International Monetary Fund holds the skeleton key to this crisis, and that key is called special drawing rights. If you've never heard of SDRs, you're not alone. They're intentionally obscure, a kind of shadow currency that exists in the accounting ledgers of central banks, but never touches the hands of ordinary people. Created in 1969 as a supplement to gold and dollar reserves, SDRs are a claim on a basket of the world's major currencies: the dollar, euro, yuan, yen, and pound sterling. Think of them as international monetary poker chips that central banks can exchange for real currency when needed. Here's what makes them powerful. SDRs can be created out of thin air by the IMF with an 85% majority vote. No taxpayer money required. No debt incurred. It's liquidity conjured into existence, distributed to member nations based on their IMF quota. In August 2021, in response to the COVID-19 economic catastrophe, the IMF issued $650 billion in SDRs, the largest allocation in history. Ostensibly, this was to help countries cope with pandemic-related economic damage. But if you read between the lines, if you study how nations actually use their SDR allocations, a different picture emerges. Countries like Lebanon and Egypt immediately converted their SDRs to foreign currency and used it to service existing debts. Argentina used SDRs to avoid default. Pakistan shored up foreign reserves to prevent a balance of payments crisis. In effect, SDRs became a mechanism to replace expensive debt with cheaper debt, to postpone the day of reckoning without solving the underlying problem. But they could be something more. They could be the instrument of an actual reset. Imagine this. The IMF issues another massive SDR allocation, perhaps $1 trillion or more, but this time with explicit conditions. Countries receiving SDRs must use a portion to restructure unsustainable debts. Creditors, banks, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, agree to write down a percentage of what they're owed, taking losses but avoiding the chaos of disorderly default. In exchange, debtor nations commit to fiscal reforms, eliminating subsidies that distort markets, improving tax collection, investing in productive assets rather than consumption. The IMF provides technical assistance and monitoring to ensure compliance. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Orderly. Fair. The problem is the politics. Creating $1 trillion in SDRs requires approval from nations holding 85% of the voting power in the IMF. The United States alone holds 16.7% of the vote, giving it an effective veto. And the U.S. Treasury Department, under multiple administrations, has been deeply skeptical of large SDR allocations, arguing that too much of the benefit flows to wealthy nations that don't need it, or worse, to adversarial regimes like Iran, Russia, or Venezuela. There's also the moral hazard question. If you bail out profligate borrowers, don't you encourage more reckless borrowing in the future? If countries know they'll be rescued, why reform? Why make painful choices? Why not just kick the can down the road and wait for the next crisis to trigger the next bailout? These are legitimate concerns. They're also convenient excuses for inaction, because the alternative, letting the debt crisis metastasize into a full-scale financial meltdown, is unthinkable. Bank failures, sovereign defaults, currency collapses, unemployment surging to Great Depression levels, social unrest, authoritarianism, war. History shows us where economic desperation leads. But here's where it gets truly interesting, where conspiracy theories blur into plausible scenarios. What if the reset isn't going to be negotiated? What if it's going to be imposed? In 2026, the Basel III endgame fully phases in across major economies. Banks are forced to hold significantly more capital against their risk-weighted assets. Suddenly, loans that were profitable at low interest rates become unprofitable. Credit tightens. Businesses can't roll over debts. Defaults spike. Housing markets, commercial real estate, leverage buyouts, all the frothy excess built on cheap money, comes crashing down. Not all at once. Not a repeat of 2008's sudden collapse. This time, it's a slow grind, a managed deflation. Banks, fortified by higher capital requirements, can absorb losses that would have killed them 15 years ago. They survive. But the borrowers? The borrowers get crushed. Companies that should have failed years ago finally do. Unproductive debt gets written off. Malinvestment is purged from a system. It's painful. Unemployment rises. Growth stalls. Governments face a choice, bailout or reform. And here's where the coordination happens. Central banks, having spent a decade pumping money into the system, reverse course. Quantitative tightening. Balance sheet reduction. The money supply contracts. Asset prices fall. Wealth accumulated during the bubble years evaporates. But debt? Debt is nominal. Debt is sticky. Debt doesn't deflate with asset prices. It just becomes harder to pay. So governments step in with restructuring frameworks. The G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatments, launched in 2020, provides a template. Creditors, public and private, negotiate haircuts. Debts are extended, interest rates reduced, or principal forgiven. In exchange, debtor nations implement reforms. State-owned enterprises are privatized. Labor markets are liberalized. Pension ages increase. Subsidies end. It's austerity, but dressed up as structural reform. It's debt relief, but only for those who comply. And those who don't comply? Those who refuse to play by the new rules, who insist on sovereignty, who reject the conditions. They're cut off. No access to international capital markets. No IMF support. No World Bank loans. They become financial pariahs, forced to either capitulate or collapse. This is the leverage that international financial institutions have always wielded, but it's rarely been deployed so comprehensively, so globally, with such coordinated intent. Is this a conspiracy? Or is this simply how the system works when pushed to its limits? The answer depends on whether you think coordination constitutes conspiracy. There are no smoke-filled rooms where shadowy figures plot global domination. There are conference rooms in Basel and Washington and Brussels where technocrats, armed with spreadsheets and stress tests, make decisions that ripple through the lives of billions. They're not evil. They genuinely believe they're preventing catastrophe. They're probably right. But that doesn't mean there aren't winners and losers. That doesn't mean the costs are distributed fairly. That doesn't mean the people bearing those costs had any say in the matter. There's a reason S&P Global's report talks about the need for community acceptance of the Great Reset. Because without acceptance, without acquiescence, restructuring debt on this scale requires force. Economic force, certainly. But when economic force fails, other kinds of force follow. We've seen this play out in Greece, where the Troika, the European Commission, European Central Bank, and IMF imposed brutal austerity in exchange for bailouts. Pensions were slashed. Public assets were sold. Unemployment hit 27%. Sovereignty became a fiction. And Greece had no choice because the alternative was expulsion from the Eurozone, economic annihilation, societal collapse. Now scale that scenario globally. Every country in debt distress faces a version of the Greek dilemma. Every country must choose between compliance and catastrophe. And because the debt is global, because the system is interconnected, there's no opting out. There's no alternative currency to flee to when the dollar and euro and yuan are all playing by the same rules. Unless you believe in the decentralization narratives. Unless you think cryptocurrencies offer an escape hatch. Unless you're willing to bet that gold, that ancient store of value, will rise from its decades-long slumber to become the asset of last resort. And here's where the central banks have gotten ahead of you. Central Bank Digital Currencies, CBDCs, are in development across dozens of nations. China's digital yuan is already in pilot programs. The European Central Bank is designing a digital euro. The Federal Reserve is researching a digital dollar, though everyone knows research is just plausible deniability until the moment they flip the switch. CBDCs offer central banks something they've never had before: complete visibility into every transaction, perfect enforcement of monetary policy, the ability to turn money on and off like a utility. Negative interest rates become enforceable. Can't withdraw cash if cash doesn't exist. Tax evasion becomes nearly impossible. Every transaction is tracked, recorded, reported. And in a debt restructuring scenario, CBDCs offer the ultimate tool: programmable money. Imagine SDRs distributed not as abstract accounting entries, but as digital currencies programmed to be spent only in certain ways. Relief funds for developing nations that can only be used for food, medicine, or infrastructure, not diverted to offshore accounts or military spending. Debt payments automatically deducted from government accounts. No negotiation, no default, just direct transfer from debtor to creditor, enforced by code. This isn't speculation. This is explicitly discussed in IMF working papers, in central bank research, in the technical documentation for CBDC pilots. The technology exists. The framework exists. All that's missing is the crisis severe enough to justify implementation. And 2026 might just provide that crisis. Basel III Endgame raises capital requirements for major banks right as global debt servicing costs hit record levels. Credit tightens. Defaults rise. Markets panic. Governments, desperate to prevent total collapse, implement emergency measures. CBDCs are rolled out as temporary liquidity solutions. SDR allocations are tied to CBDC adoption. Debt restructuring is automated through digital platforms. And just like that, the financial reset isn't a negotiation. It's a software update. Does this sound dystopian? Perhaps. Does it sound implausible? Ask yourself. If you were a central banker staring at $300 trillion of unpayable debt, knowing that conventional tools have failed, knowing that another crisis could topple governments and economies, wouldn't you use every tool available? Wouldn't you argue that individual privacy is a small price to pay for systemic stability? Wouldn't you convince yourself that centralized control in responsible hands is preferable to chaos? They would. They will. They are. And the general public, exhausted by inflation, by job insecurity, by the grinding anxiety of late-stage capitalism, will likely accept it. Because the alternative, the complete breakdown of the financial system, is terrifying. Because people want stability, even if that stability comes with surveillance. Because when you're drowning, you don't ask questions about the lifeguard's credentials. You just grab the hand. But here's what they're not telling you in the glossy brochures about the Great Reset, in the technocratic assurances that everything will be fine if we just trust the experts. Resets don't erase debt equally. They redistribute it. Someone's asset is someone else's liability. When debt is written down, someone loses. When currencies are restructured, purchasing power shifts. When the rules change, those who wrote the rules benefit. So ask yourself, who sits on the Basel Committee? Who controls the IMF? Who designs the frameworks for debt restructuring and digital currencies? Is it elected representatives accountable to voters? Or is it central bankers, finance ministers, and institutional investors whose primary obligation is to stability, which in practice means protecting the existing power structure? The reset will preserve the system, but it won't necessarily preserve your place in it. Your savings, your pension, your property, all denominated in currencies and financial instruments subject to restructuring, all vulnerable to the decisions made in conference rooms you'll never enter by people you'll never meet. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is how international finance works. This is the machinery beneath the surface, visible to anyone willing to read the technical documents, the regulatory filings, the central bank speeches. They're not hiding it. They're just counting on you not paying attention, not connecting the dots, not realizing that the debate about Basel III Endgame or IMF SDR allocations or CBDC implementation isn't abstract wonkery. It's the architecture of your financial future being built in real time. So what should you do? Honestly, there's no easy answer. Diversification helps. Don't keep all your assets in one currency, one country, one asset class. Hard assets, real estate, commodities, land, are harder to restructure away than financial instruments. Skills, relationships, community resilience. These matter when systems fail. But mostly, you should understand what's coming. You should know that 2026 isn't just another year. It's a deadline, a convergence point where regulatory changes, debt dynamics, and political pressures collide. It's the year when the consequences of 15 years of monetary experimentation come due. It's the year when we find out if coordination can save us or if reset means collapse. And you should ask yourself the question that defines this entire story. When the architects of the financial system tell you a reset is necessary, when they promise it will be orderly and fair, when they assure you it's for the greater good, do you trust them? Do you trust that the people who build a system with 349% debt to GDP leverage, who assured you before 2008 that the housing market was fine, who printed trillions of dollars and claimed inflation was transitory, do you trust that they've suddenly figured out how to fix the mess they created? Or do you recognize that trust isn't the question? That power is the question. That when you owe the bank $1,000, you have a problem, but when the world owes the banks $300 trillion, the banks have a problem. And they're about to make that problem everyone's. What would you have done if you were in their position? If you held the levers of global finance and watched the debt spiral out of control, would you have done anything differently? Would you have had the courage to impose austerity when your political career depended on promising prosperity? Would you have raised interest rates earlier, triggering recession, knowing you'd be blamed? Or would you have done exactly what they did? Postpone, extend, pretend, and hope that somehow, someway, growth would outrun debt? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you think the reset is salvation or subjugation. Tell me if you believe coordination is cooperation or conspiracy. And if you crave more stories like this, stories that pull back the curtain on the machinery that shapes your world, that test the limits of truth and power, that refuse to accept easy answers, subscribe. Because the next one might just change how you see history itself. Or it might change how you see the future. And in 2026, those might be the same thing.